Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jason Harte, and I manage the debt collection team in Mason, Hayes Curran. We're delighted to be joined this morning by one of Ireland's foremost economists, Jim Power. Jim and I are going to talk about the COVID-19 situation and what the future might hold for the economy and for businesses into the future. We're going to try to make this session as interactive as possible, and you'll notice that there's a Q&A function on your screens. So during the talk, if you want to enter any questions, we'll try to take them, and Jim and I will answer them toward the end. Jim, you're very welcome, even virtually, to Mason, Hayes Curran.
Thank you very much, Jason. My pleasure.
The bunker that you're stuck in, Jim, seems to have plenty of books, at least. How have you been coping during the lockdown?
Well, I've been quite lucky. I have worked from home for the last 12 years. I have a fully equipped office. I have Bloomberg screens. I have all the technology I want, and obviously lots of books. So in that respect, I've been really busy over the last couple of months. The one thing I suppose that has really changed is I tend to do a lot of stuff on the speaking circuit, and I think I've had about 25 events cancelled over the last couple of months. And I suppose the one that hits me hardest is this morning's announcement that the Dublin City Marathon has been cancelled. So I'll have to wait another year to bridge that gap again. But I'm doing fine. I mean, it's strange, very strange times, but I'm probably luckier than a lot of people in terms of my working situation.
That is unfortunate in relation to the marathon, and particularly as you were just getting the distance up since they lifted the 2K to 5K from your house.
Absolutely.
I know what you mean though about not getting out and about. There's I suppose even with colleagues, there's 20 of us in the debt collection team collecting debts for banks, for businesses, and for the public sector. And we shut the office in mid-March. And I haven't seen most of my colleagues other than on Zoom. And given the social distancing requirement that's going to be ahead of us for the foreseeable future, I think it'll be quite some time before the 20 of us are together on the floor again. Jim, you've said to me in the past that economics is based upon human behavior, and that human behavior often defies prediction. But there seems to be fairly universal agreement, even among people like economists, that the collapse in the world economy that's been brought about by the coronavirus pandemic has been the worst in about a century. Globally, Jim, how bad is it?
Well, Jason, I teach on the full-time MBA in Smurfit Business School in UCD, and first lecture, first day, I always tell my students that anybody who believes that economists are capable of forecasting the future are mad, because economics is a social science. It's not like chemistry where you put two compounds into a test tube and you get a certain result. It's driven by human behavior. And the other thing I would always say is that one should always expect the unexpected. When I sat down in January of this year, as I always do at the beginning of the year, to write about the year ahead, to see what the opportunities, the risk factors are, I have to say I was a little bit more upbeat about the year ahead, largely on the basis that 2019 in growth terms was the lowest level of economic activity since 2007, 2008, largely down to two factors. One was Donald Trump and the Chinese and the ongoing trade dispute. And, you know, that was seriously threatening global business confidence. The whole free trade model was under serious pressure. The second issue was Brexit. You know, there was a sense of paralysis, particularly in Ireland and the UK last year in relation to the Brexit situation. And I felt in January that two things would happen. Britain would avoid a hard Brexit, at least on the 31st of January. And secondly, and much more importantly, that ahead of the presidential election in November, Donald Trump, who wants to win that election, obviously would do his utmost to try and defuse the trade dispute with China, because the last thing he would want going into an election is a US economy in trouble, and indeed a global economy in trouble because of his trade dispute with China. And coming towards the end of February, I was feeling pretty smug. You know, Trump did back off the trade dispute, and we saw a pretty significant dissipating of that problem. And secondly, Britain avoided a hard Brexit, albeit only temporarily, but it avoided the hard Brexit on the 31st of January. So things were starting to look pretty good in January, February. And then, of course, the unexpected happened. COVID-19 blew up. The impact on the global economy has been absolutely calamitous. You know, large swathes of the world economy have effectively been shut down. And I think very damagingly, international travel, air travel, tourism has been decimated around the world. The International Monetary Fund has described this year the potential to have the sharpest slowdown in economic activity since the 1920s. So, and every single economic indicator you look at, they're pretty dire. And I can assure you, Jason, in years to come, you know, when we're looking back at this year, I always look back at slides for 2007, 2008, and I always make the comment that if Carlsberg were going to do recessions, 2007, 2008 was it, because most economic indicators literally fell off a cliff. But I think that's been emulated this time. The declines will be much more sudden, will be much sharper. My only hope, of course, would be that the recovery from this will be much quicker than we saw in 2007, 2008. But yeah, it's a pretty dire global economic backdrop at the moment. But at least we're starting to see a gradual reopening of economic activity at this stage.
I suppose accepting that it is, as you say, completely dire, accepting that it's possibly the worst recession in a century or so. It does feel, though, that governments and policymakers have had a lot of experience of crisis management. It seems that we're barely over the last crisis, as you said, the crisis that began in the financial services sector from 2008 or so onwards. What do you think of the global response to the pandemic so far?
Well, if you want to draw the parallels with what happened in 2007, 2008, the moment the crisis hit, the US responded very aggressively. Interest rates were taken down to zero very quickly. Quantitative easing or bond buying was implemented very, very quickly. And thirdly, the first thing Obama did after he assumed the presidency was a massive fiscal stimulus package. So the United States reacted very aggressively, but not so on this side of the world. Europe, as is always the case with the European Union, found it very difficult to engineer a coordinated response to the crisis. There was no sense that you were going to have a fiscal stimulus package. The European Central Bank was very slow in cutting interest rates. It was very slow in implementing quantitative easing. And that's typical of Europe's problem. You know, whenever there is a crisis, it takes a long time for Europe, all the 28 countries then, 27 countries now, to agree on a response. And eventually, once you get an agreement, it's a compromise, it's watered down, and it's delayed. And that really haunted the Eurozone recovery over the last 10 or 12 years. This time around, you know, we've seen a very significant global response. As usual, the United States reacted very aggressively. The Federal Reserve took rates back to zero in 2 emergency moves in early March. It announced major packages of quantitative easing or bond buying, and then the Trump presidency has implemented a number of very, very significant fiscal stimulus packages, and that is ongoing. In Europe, the response was a little bit slower, and this is, as I say, again, the problem for Europe. It was difficult to reach an agreement on what had to be done. We had an unedifying spat, for example, between the Portuguese and the Dutch, because the southern European economies believe there should be a coordinated response to this. It's a whole of Europe effort, whereas and what they want is what's called debt mutualization. In other words, the debt each country runs up becomes European debt rather than national debt. But the Austrians, the Finns, the Germans, the Dutch were totally opposed to that. So the response out of Europe was slower. But in the last 24 hours, we're starting to see significant progress. A 500 billion euro package of grants for businesses across the EU has been agreed by France and Germany. The other 25 countries will now have to agree. But once you get the French and the Germans to agree to something, that's a positive start. And that is the first semblance we've seen ever in Europe of the concept of debt mutualization, which is necessary. The second bit then was the European Central Bank did act very aggressively, very quickly. It announced an extra package of quantitative easing of 750 billion euro. So in total this year, they will buy over €1 trillion in bonds to keep bond yields down. And I suppose the third part of the European response is that I believe this should have happened prior to COVID-19, but COVID-19 has obviously accelerated the need for it, and that is the EU fiscal rules are being torn up. Those fiscal rules limited a country's potential to borrow to 3% of GDP in a downturn. Those rules have now been discarded, and I think there's a general recognition across Europe at this stage, including here in Ireland, that for the next few years we will have to accept big fiscal deficits. We will have to accept higher levels of debt in order to take the global and the European economy out of what is a pretty unprecedented economic crisis. So in answering your question in a very long-winded way, Jason, I think the global response has been decent. It continues to build because a lot more of support will be required for the next 12, 18 months because, the view that once the economies and the businesses start to open up again, that things return to normal ain't the case. The recovery is going to be slow. It's going to be staggered. Unfortunately, you may get secondary outbreaks of the virus, which will be a little bit like firefighting. They'll have to go in and quench the fire wherever it breaks out. So the likelihood is it'll be a stop-start process. And of course, for businesses, it'll take some time for business volumes to return to normal levels because of a lack of consumer confidence and health fears, also because of social distancing requirements and so on. I would say that until a vaccine is actually delivered, economic activity will be nervous. And I think for the next 18 months, nothing certain here, but I think we should build in as a central assumption that the world economy is going to deliver below potential or subpar growth over the next 18 months. Economists are very good at displaying their knowledge of the alphabet by describing the type of economic cycle, V-shaped, U-shaped, L-shaped. On this particular occasion, I definitely would go for the Nike swirl, the Nike swoosh, a sharp downturn and then a gradual recovery over the next 18 months. But at least, and this is the really positive thing, we are starting to see the restrictions on economic activity being lifted in a number of countries, and it's spreading. It will not be without speed bumps, but at least we're now starting to move in the right direction. I think we look back and say that April and May will represent the low point of the economic cycle and that things can only get better from here. All, of course, subject to the virus, which is outside of the realms of the expertise of an economist.
Undoubtedly. I was just thinking there, what you said in relation to the European response and how it varied and the discrepancies. Even in a microcosm of that economy, like the world of debt collection, we always say that the further south you go in Europe, the harder it is to collect debt. And we're a team like ours to be trying to operate maybe in Scandinavia or so, there isn't as much demand for debt collection work or debt collection litigation. If we can zoom into Ireland specifically, Jim, most of us, I think, hadn't heard of COVID-19 before mid-January, but we had at least a bit of warning as to what might happen throughout, I suppose, February and early March, that we could see the situation unfolding in China and particularly in Italy. But nonetheless, I think that the speed and the scale, as you said, of the virus spread has been unprecedented. Talk to me about its impact in Ireland from March onward, maybe.
Yeah, Jason, I remember I was looking back, I did a presentation in the middle of February to the Institute of Directors, and I had things to watch in 2020, and in the middle of it was COVID-19, but it was in the middle, it wasn't top. I suppose I'm glad I'd included it, but my view was that this will be a SARS type event. You know, it'll have a regional impact in China and Asia, parts of Asia, but that we'd emerge from it pretty quickly. But you know, once the first week of March hit, the WHO declared it a global pandemic. Suddenly the rules of the game changed. And since the 15th of March, I mean, large swathes of the Irish economy have been forced to shut down. The statistics coming out of Ireland at the moment are pretty dramatic. You know, if you look at these purchasing managers indices, which is a monthly confidence survey of manufacturing, services and construction, they have all collapsed, but particularly services and construction. Manufacturing less badly hit. And that's important for Ireland because chemical and pharma is a very big part of our manufacturing economy, and particularly our merchandise export economy. And that sector is largely unaffected. Okay, so the overall impact, the overall impact on manufacturing isn't too bad, but the rest of the economy in serious difficulty. Consumer confidence absolutely collapsed. Retail sales and car sales, we're starting to see the impact feeding through now. So, and of course, the most visible and the most painful part of the lot is the fact that over 1.2 million people are now in receipt of some sort of unemployment benefit. So, you know, that's a significant problem. So, yeah, it's been mad. And we look back at the economic statistics. You know, in January, we were worried about the implications of a fully employed economy, labour shortages, upward pressure on wages, and so on, as a major constraint on growth. And we now have virtually 25% unemployment in the system. So it's been absolutely catastrophic. I didn't think I'd ever see anything like this happening in my lifetime. And I suppose there's a few things you can say about it. Number one, you know, it's a global issue. It's not just Ireland, because we were really at the eye of the storm in 2007, 2008. That global response we spoke about a few minutes ago will help Ireland, particularly the quantitative easing and the interest rate environment. That will help us. But the Irish government itself, you know, it's lending a lot of support to the system. And I think anybody who believes its job is nearly done or will be done after 3 months is naive. You know, the Irish government is going to have to continue to lend significant support to the Irish economy for probably the next 18, 24 months, but hopefully on a reducing basis. You know, as activity gradually picks up, the need for remedial support will gradually wane, but that support will absolutely follow. We've got to accept, in my view, that there will be higher levels of, we'll have to borrow more, much more than we'd be comfortable with for at least the next couple of years. Our government debt levels will rise significantly further. I think we've got to accept that, as indeed will every country in the world. Because when you're hit with a shock like this, in my view, there is only one response. You throw the kitchen sink. And I said from day one of this crisis that the most important thing, in my view, is that as we reopen the economy, we need to make sure that as many of those businesses that were viable pre-COVID are viable post-COVID, and they open up. Because without viable businesses, we will not re-employ the 1.2 million people. We will not be able to rebuild the economy, particularly in an area like tourism. So, and thankfully, we are in a good place to borrow. Government bond yields here are close to zero, so thanks to the ECB. So the Irish government is able to borrow for virtually nothing. And secondly, there is a willingness to lend money to Ireland. If you think back to 10 or 12 years ago, there was a populist narrative out there. You heard it virtually every night on the Vincent Browne show that Ireland should default on its debt and walk away from it. If we had defaulted back then, our ability to borrow today would be significantly undermined. So we're in a better place to deal with this. But obviously, it's not ideal. It's painful, but at least there is some hope.
Your video has been freezing there from time to time, Jim. I hope it's settled now. But we had you on audio, so we'll keep going. We've a broad audience on the webinar this morning, Jim. Everyone from sole traders, small businesses, all the way through to medium and large companies, and even some banks, insurers, who will be extending credit in this economy, or seeking to collect upon it. I know you've given a fair bit of thought and analysis to the various sectors within the economy, and how specifically they're going to be affected. Maybe you'd take us through them.
Okay, since this crisis began, I've been working with a lot of the organizations that represent SMEs in the hospitality sector, restaurants, hotels, the SME sector generally. So if this slide here gives you what I would describe as the hierarchy of pain, top of the pile is definitely the whole tourism and travel area, because when you think about it, last year we had 10.8 million overseas visitors into the country, which was a record. And based on the first couple of months of this year, it did appear that we were going to exceed that level this year. So all looking very good. And then, of course, global travel has shut down. Very few international visitors will come here this year. You'd be very nervous about what will happen next year because of fears of travel and so on. So tourism and travel most badly hit, and within that, the hospitality sector, pubs, restaurants, hotels, the motor industry, which thankfully got to reopen yesterday, but we've seen car sales collapse over the last couple of months. And I suppose the point was that coming into this crisis, new car sales were already down about 6% year to date. So the industry, having fallen again last year, so the industry was under a bit of pressure. This has been bad. Construction was forced to shut down very quickly, but I'd be more optimistic about the construction side in the sense that, as the restrictions are lifted, building will recommence, and there is a significant requirement for a lot more building in this country over the coming years. So construction will rebound pretty quickly. Non-grocery retail, I would have serious concerns there because we've seen some very bad news from some of the UK multiples here, since the Debenhams and so on, since the crisis erupted. So the danger is that many of our non-grocery retailers may find it difficult to survive and may find it difficult to recommence business unless it gets massive support. The agri-food sector, excuse me, for once, farming was not at the center of this crisis. And in fact, the agri-food sector has done reasonably well through this crisis. I'm not suggesting for one moment it hasn't affected, but at least the demand for food has been very, very strong. Although one of the issues they would have is that food service businesses, the food service side of it has died and will be slow to come back. Manufacturing, as I mentioned, given the preponderance of chemical pharma here, manufacturing generally has held up well. I was talking to somebody from one of the multinational pharma companies in the last couple of days who was saying that they are absolutely ran off their feet, deciding where to distribute medicines manufactured in Ireland throughout Europe and indeed throughout the world. Grocery retail has done reasonably well in the sense that sales have been significantly stronger. But I would say that it has been affected. Social distancing damages the business. There has been definitely a preponderance of demand for lower margin rather than higher margin product. So it's not without its problems, but it's relative to other sectors. It's in a strong place. Pharmacies, likewise, in a strong place. So that's the sort of sectoral, the hierarchy of pain as I describe it. And the opening up of all of those sectors that have been forced to close down, it will be slow, it will be gradual, it will be subject to social distancing, it will be subject to pretty extreme health protocols, which will undermine business and increase the cost of doing business. And that's why I just think it is so important that government tears up the rule books here, that they pump as much support as is required to make sure as many of those businesses as possible are, number one, able to reopen, and number two, survive the next 18 months of more difficult trading conditions. And because at the end of the day, without businesses, we won't re-employ the 1.2 million people. We won't be able to rebuild the economy. Could you imagine, say, 2022, if international travel gets back on track, people start to visit again? Could you imagine our tourism sector without our pubs, restaurants, hotels? It'd be very, very difficult to build it. So I couldn't overemphasize the importance here of supporting business to the greatest extent possible.
Let's talk a bit about the government response. So, Jim, back, I suppose, in March, when the Taoiseach's first announcements were made in relation to communicating the closure of schools, the closure of certain public buildings, etc., there was quite a good degree of praise for the government. We also were fairly quick to announce the pandemic unemployment payment for people who were laid off, and the temporary wage subsidy scheme to support employers. What's your assessment of the Irish government response to date, and what do you think? What more do you think will need to be done?
I think the Irish government response has been generally good, to be honest. Recognised day one that there was a huge imperative to come in here to support businesses because cash flow died, but all the expenses remained in place. So I think the strategy has been generally good in the circumstances. Clearly, I was going to say they don't recognise it. They do, of course, recognise it. But they just, I suppose, haven't yet really articulated the view. But the biggest challenge is the immediate one, in making sure that during this period of close down, that businesses and households are supported financially, okay? And that's been done pretty aggressively. The second piece will be that as businesses are reopened, that the support doesn't end there. There will be an ongoing requirement for business support, albeit on a gradually declining basis as things gradually improve. So, I think the response has been pretty decent, to be honest. You can have criticisms about bits of it, but let's face it, if you're hit with a once-in-a-lifetime global pandemic, you don't have a rule book telling you what you should do. It's challenging. And of course, the biggest challenge now is balancing the economic imperative against the health imperative. Clearly, the Chief Medical Officer, Tony Holohan, and his people, their main priority is to ensure the health of the nation based on the premise that a healthy nation is a healthy economy. So that's one side of the argument. The other side of the argument is that we can't sustain a shutdown economy for too much longer. So there's massive pressure building to open up different sectors of the economy. So that is an incredibly difficult balancing act, because that there is a fear that if you open up too quickly, you'll get a re-emergence of the virus, forcing another shutdown, which would be an awful thing to have to do. So there is a huge balancing act here. And I am loath to criticize because it is incredibly challenging. I mean, the decisions that have been made at the moment on both the economy side and on the health side, they've never had to be made before. What if we get it wrong? Will we make mistakes? Inevitably, there will be mistakes made. But I think, broadly speaking, our approach has been pretty decent. And say the important thing is to make sure that, it continues and that we rebuild our economy and our society as quickly as possible over the next couple of years. I think that's really important. I think it would help, I won't say it would help. I think it's essential at this stage that we get a permanent government in place as quickly as possible to pass the legislation that will be required to continue to work our way out of this crisis. So I think the politicians have got to man up and get on with it and form a government as quickly as possible, and a stable government that will agree on a strategy. And I think there's two parts of that strategy. One is the immediate challenge of dealing with COVID-19, but the other part of the strategy is that a lot of those issues that dominated the February 8th election have not gone away. Housing, health, and of course Brexit. Brexit ain't gone away. And if you look at what's happening in the UK at the moment, the total the total unwillingness of Boris Johnson to contemplate applying for an extension to the transition period beyond the 31st of December, that's dangerous. And it's particularly dangerous if you observe what's happening in the trade negotiations at the moment. There is a distinct possibility still that Britain could exit the transition mechanism at the end of the year without a trade deal being done, in which case WTO trading arrangements would apply from January 1st next, one presumes. So for Irish businesses, you still need to think about Brexit and the implications of it. I actually think that a lot of the preparations that Irish business did for Brexit actually helped during the COVID-19 crisis in terms of getting supply chains more efficient, etc., etc. But there's still a lot of challenges, but we do need in my view, a strong, stable government in place as quickly as possible to push ahead with that very, very challenging agenda.
One of the things that you said that we need, obviously, is an unprecedented response. You talked about throwing the kitchen sink at that. But the issue with giving that kind of massive level of support to business and to society, Jim, is of course that it has to be financed. And I think from what you're suggesting there, we may not be talking support of billions, but possibly tens of billions. Can the country afford to pay for that in the years ahead?
Okay, I estimated at the beginning of this crisis, back in the middle of March, that ultimately it would require at least 10% of GDP to address the issues that need to be addressed during this crisis. That would imply about 33, 34 billion in support for the economy. That's a lot of borrowing. That's a lot of debt added to an already high level of debt in the country. We had 205 billion in debt coming into this, but at least it was moving in the right direction. Now it's moving in the wrong direction as well. I don't think it's, a question of can we do this? I don't believe there's any choice. We've got to do this. We have got to accept we have to borrow more over the next couple of years. We've got to accept we will build up a bigger debt legacy, to save our economy. Because ultimately, we cannot turn around at the end of this, having run up significant deficits, and impose austerity, as in higher taxes and cuts in government spending. What we need to do over the next couple of years is continue to push the boat out, try and get the economic growth cycle moving as quickly as possible, because as economic growth improves, tax revenues increase, you get tax revenue buoyancy in the system, pressure on government social welfare expenditure starts to reduce as less people are unemployed. So you get this virtuous cycle of improvement in the fiscal situation. And, you know, ultimately, maybe 3 or 4 years down the road, we can look at rebalancing the tax situation to address the deficit if it's still a significant problem. But in my view, it would be absolutely mad to follow this period with a period of austerity. That, in my view, would risk turning a recession into a depression. And that is not just an Irish issue. That's an issue virtually every government in the world will be facing over the coming months. So austerity is not the approach. And the good news is we can borrow, and we can borrow very cheaply. So I just think we need to exploit that to keep our business model going. You know, I think, in my view, there is no doubt about that, because at the end of the day, also, one of the really important things is to prevent what is an economic crisis caused by a health crisis from morphing into a banking crisis. Because over the years, the International Monetary Fund, an organization we grew to love in this country, or not, as the case might be, after 2011, the International Monetary Fund over the years has done lots of research on previous recessions, and they always concluded that when a recession is caused by a shock to the banking system, it tends to be deeper and tends to be more difficult to remedy than a recession that's caused by a shock to something else, such as the ICT bubble bursting in the early 2000s, oil price shocks, and so on. This is 2007, 2008 was very much a banking crisis. You know, the function of banks to act as an intermediary between savers and borrowers, which is the kernel of economic activity, broke down. It is, and that's why it took so long and it was so expensive to sort that problem out. And it was not just an Irish problem, it was a global problem. This time around, what we have to ensure is that we don't allow this economic crisis wipe out households and businesses who in turn will not be able to service their loans and so on. And very quickly, this could morph into a significant banking crisis. And at the weekend, John Moore, the former Sec-Gen of the Department of Finance during the crisis, you know, I was kind of reassured to hear him coming out arguing very cogently about the risks of this morphing into a banking crisis. That then would be a whole new realm of difficulty. We cannot allow that happen, in my view.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that credit and the extension of bank credit will be hugely important in helping businesses get through this particular crisis. It's my own view that the Irish businesses that get through this are going to be those that manage their collections and their credit policy well. Businesses obviously should be communicating, taking this time to do that with the customers that they have. And I think there'll be two reasons for that, Jim. Obviously to collect any money that they're owed now, but also to inform any decisions that business make into the future in relation to how they extend credit. As I understand it, there's going to have to be a state-backed guarantee in relation to credit that's given, which is going to give a lot of reassurance that the businesses that are going to open will open, and hopefully will not alone survive, but thrive in the months and the next 2 years. How would you see that working?
It's very easy, Jason, for economists and those of us who stand on the fence, you know, arguing that the banking sector needs to support every business full stop, lend money to them, give them payment, repayment holidays, etc., etc. But of course, the real issue is that we need a healthy banking system to have a healthy economy. And coming into this crisis, there was still a legacy in the banking system from the 2007-2008 crash. You know, there was still a bad debt problem that was being worked through. We'd made a lot of progress. I think I think I could say without fear of significant contradiction that Irish banking was still fragile coming into this. So the notion now that you would turn around and force banks to lend money to businesses that will be high risk over the next couple of years, that's not going to happen. You know, it's just not going to happen. Any sensible banker would look at a lot of the business out there today and decide, oh, that's really risky stuff. Not sure we should be going there. So I think that's why, and it's happening in many countries, particularly France, where the government steps in, and indeed in the UK, the government steps in and guarantees a lot of that lending. It has to, otherwise it will not happen. And if it does happen without a guarantee, you know, the banks will be in serious trouble another couple of years down the road from a bad debt problem. So I think state guarantees have got to be, particularly for smaller companies, has got to be part of the solution to this. And I also think, Jason, for people in your industry, you need to take a much more conciliatory approach with debt enforcement. You know, you've got to understand, you can tell me to shut up when you want to now, but I think you've got to understand the exceptional nature of the business problems at the moment. The fact that businesses are in trouble not because of something they did or didn't do, they were forced to shut down. So I think there needs to be, cognizance needs to be taken of those exceptional circumstances in judgment and enforcement issues. I think it's vital for every business to be communicating with its clients on a regular basis. I think there is going to have to be a strong level of forbearance and flexibility. Businesses will have to, you know, disclose fully their situation. So I think we all really need to put our heads together in working through this situation. But a key part of it has got to be the state providing some sort of loan guarantee to get us through this problem.
Absolutely. Even in terms of taking legal actions, you might expect or think that I want that kind of stampede, but I've always said that businesses should never pursue through debt collection litigation those who can't pay. They should simply sue those who won't pay.
Okay, absolutely.
Jim, I'm going to go to the floor now, and we've got in quite a good deal of questions. There's quite a few questions on one of your favourite subjects, the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on Irish property prices. What's your view there?
Okay, I wouldn't have a great track record in terms of house prices, Jason, but I'll give it a stab. If you look at the fundamentals that drive the housing market, you know, the demand and supply issues, on the demand side, demographics are important. The economic environment is important. The level of employment, the level of unemployment, access to credit, all of these issues drive demand for housing. And on the supply side, obviously, it's the supply of housing that's there to meet that demand. Coming into this crisis, we had COVID-19 crisis. We had a crisis in the housing market in the sense that demand exceeded supply. And for a number of years, we'd seen rapid inflation in house prices and in rental costs. In the last 12 months, thankfully, a lot of those pressures started to evaporate. And in the last 18 months, we saw house price inflation decelerate rapidly. We didn't see rents falling back, but they were starting to show signs of stabilization. The real reason house prices were falling back was not because supply was meeting demand. It was primarily down to affordability issues because of the central bank's mortgage lending restrictions, which the central bank is very unlikely to alter even in the aftermath of this crisis. Highly unlikely, I would have thought, and indeed I would hope. There was an affordability issue. Based on the prevailing level of house prices, a lot of people quite simply could not borrow sufficient money to pay the price that was on offer. And as a consequence, we saw, in my view, a welcome deceleration in house price inflation. So the market was already weakening. And then if you apply those economic fundamentals to what the next 12 months is going to look like, high unemployment, incomes under pressure, economic growth in serious negative territory, and so on, you'd have to think that house prices will probably fall this year by, maybe 10, 15% based on a pretty non-functioning market. But then if you look beyond this, when the economy starts to recover again, be it 2021 and into 2022, those demand fundamentals will reassert themselves. There will still be a lack of adequate supply. So I would expect house prices to start rising again. But for the foreseeable future, it's just hard to see it, to be honest. And the other thing I would say at the end of all of this is that the priority in the next 5 years, and indeed I think the success or failure of the government that hopefully will be put into place shortly, will be its ability to address the housing crisis more than anything else. So in my view, there's only one way of doing that, and that is to ramp up supply as aggressively as possible. And of course, unfortunately, this year we were looking at the delivery of around 25 to 28,000 housing completions. Based on the shutdown of the sector and the gradual return of the sector, house completions this year could be 15, 17,000. We should be building around 35,000 houses per annum. So the housing problem will remain, but it needs to be addressed. It's a key area of economic competitiveness. But in answering your question, in the current environment, it's hard to see house prices going anywhere but in a downward direction.
Absolutely. There's a question here on whether interest can be charged on the late payment of debt whilst businesses have been closed for the course of the lockdown, and obviously it can, absent any legislative change. Interest can be charged pursuant to contract or might have a statutory basis. But whether a business can do it and whether it should are two entirely different things. Particularly, as you've said, Jim, this has not been caused. This shutdown has not been caused by businesses themselves. It's been forced upon them.
My view, Jason, would be it can and it shouldn't.
Very good.
I think it's incumbent to work with businesses to make sure they can survive this and come out the other end. I mean, if there were viable businesses pre-COVID-19, there's no reason why they shouldn't be viable businesses post-COVID-19, provided they get the right support.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Sorry. Those businesses, I suppose, that are making payments or that are not making payments simply because of COVID shouldn't be treated in the way that bad payers or non-payers in the normal pay way would be. There's a couple of questions, Jim, in relation to the charity or not-for-profit sector. As you know, it depends mostly on fundraising income and activities that have collapsed. How would you rank the not-for-profit sector that depends mainly on fundraising?
I mean, this is a devastating year because all of their fundraising activities are being cancelled. On the last Sunday in May, for about the 6th or 7th year in a row, I was due to do the Dublin Mountain Way for Bardstown. That's been pushed out to September. I doubt if it'll happen in September. That is their biggest fundraising event of the year. That's gone. So, the not-for-profit sector is in charities serious problems from funding issues this year. And indeed, you'd worry also about 2021. And of course, a lot of people will have less disposable income in their pockets, so there possibly will be less generosity out there as a result of all of this. So it's a tough, challenging environment. But you'd have to ask yourself the question: do these non-profit organizations fulfill a valuable role in society? And I think you'll discover, if not all cases, that yes, they do. So as a consequence of that, there is a requirement for the state to step in as well. I'm talking about massive levels of government intervention here, but I think it's necessary because we need a functioning economy, we need a functioning society, we need to address all of the areas of problem. So if the economy can't deliver it on its own, the state has got to intervene.
Absolutely. I think you see too, the incredible response, despite the fact that we have a million people or so not working, the incredible response that citizens are making to certain charities. People do know that they serve that function that you mentioned there, and how important it is to give.
Absolutely. Yeah, and another one would be the Dublin City Marathon. I mean, that's a major fundraising event for lots of charities, so that's going to be gone as well. So I think it's incumbent of all of us who would have participated or fundraised for those events, we try and do something different to raise money for them, you know?
Absolutely. I put one last question to you, Jim, on the Irish corporation tax rate. The 500 billion grant support looks like that it might, or there could be some pressure in relation to the Irish corporate tax rate. Do you think that's a concern?
Well, when I go back to my January 2020, January of this year presentation, on the list of issues for Ireland, Brexit would have remained top of the pile, but the whole corporate tax situation would also remain would have been top of the pile, because the base erosion, profit shifting agenda being driven by the OECD, which ties into the common consolidated corporate tax base from the EU. That whole process is gathering momentum. And that there is no doubt about it. There are strong international pressures to make sure that corporations pay tax in the jurisdiction where the economic activity occurs, not where the balance sheet resides. And we can argue forever that Ireland is not a tax haven, but the perception is that we are one of the tax havens out there. I was over at the European Commission in last November and sat through a presentation from a Dutch MEP, and obviously they have a good way of there's a list system in the Netherlands for MEPs, because this guy had a PhD in economics, so very compelling. But he was just so adamant that countries like his own country, the Netherlands and Ireland, were engaging in nefarious corporate tax behavior. And we can argue forever that ain't the case, but it's the perception out there. So the pressure was intensifying on our corporate tax model anyway, okay? And then if you look at the reaction to COVID-19, Trump has definitely upped the ante, because he's discovered a lot of his medical supply chain is no longer manufactured in the United States. So he's actually been strengthening that agenda about bringing jobs home, bringing investment home. So that's another pressure. So there's lots of pressures on Ireland's whole corporate tax model and the FDI environment. And of course, as you mentioned, that 500 billion, there's a possibility there will be further things tied in there. So all of the pressures are going in one direction. And it's really important for Ireland at the end of all of this that all of the other things apart from tax that make us an attractive location for foreign direct investment remain as positive as possible. Our access to the European Union market is really important. We will be the only English-speaking country. We are the only English-speaking country in the EU if you exclude Malta. Waterford, for example, will be the 5th largest English-speaking city in the European Union. Or is at the moment. So you can laugh about those things, but they are really important. They are significant for US multinationals. We need to make sure the cost base of our economy is pro-business. We need to ensure that the whole environment is as pro-investment and pro-business as possible. But the pressures are there. And that's why I would just so passionately believe also that we need to make sure, apart from the very valuable FDI sector, which implies whatever 320,000 people or thereabouts, directly and indirectly, that we back that up with a strong and indigenous SME base as possible. So we need to diversify our economic model, because parts of it are under threat. And one of those threats is what's happening on the corporate tax side. I have never believed, and I could be wrong on this, but I've never believed our 12.5% will be taken away from us. But the basis on which the tax is calculated, you know, is definitely going in one direction, which will not act in Ireland's favour, nor Luxembourg, nor the Netherlands.
I don't think anyone would laugh at Waterford, certainly not in your presence anyway, Jim. That's an interesting stat, the fifth largest English-speaking city. I'm sorry we're out of time and that I can't take any more questions. There have been more that came in. Can I thank you all for joining our webinar this morning? I hope that you found it interesting and informative. As Jim and I said, credit and maybe the guaranteeing of credit into the future is going to be a crucial factor in our economic response to COVID-19. You're all going to receive a recording of the webinar afterwards, along with a survey, which we'd be very much obliged if you would complete and return. So thanks once again for participating. A huge thanks to Jim Power, and hopefully we'll see you in the future. You can find all details of our upcoming webinars on mhc.ie. So goodbye and stay safe.
Thank you very much.